Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm promoting this new project that I'm doing. And originally I had called it LSAT Live because I figured I'd get people to join me live while I discuss different issues in test prep. And then they could ask me questions and we could get a little interaction. And I thought that might be more interesting as a vehicle for YouTube or for TikTok. Instead of just one person talking, let's get a discussion going. But it occurred to me when I was making the YouTube account tonight or today that that was a really dumb name because people who go to YouTube to watch videos are not going to be participating live. So the name kind of made sense for our meetings together. It made no sense for the LSAT, or sorry, for the YouTube channel. So I changed the name of it to LSAT Jive, which is an idea that I came up with a while back for a book. And the reason I like this term, as it pertains to LSAT prep, is that I really enjoy verbal puns, and the word jive has several different meanings. One of those meanings is like a technical slang, technical jargon. And I think if there's anything that describes the LSAT, it's that. It's a very technical language. And that's why it takes so long to prep for the LSAT, because it's very much analogous to language acquisition, learning a foreign language. And so if you would think about the process of learning a foreign language and ask yourself, would it be reasonable for me to attempt to do that in just a few months? It's intuitively obvious that that's not reasonable. You couldn't gain very much proficiency in just a few months. And that's why I've advised most of you to settle into an LSAT plan that is at least 6 months long, and in some cases as long as 12 months, particularly if you're in school or working. Now, of course, some of that depends on your practice test scores and your diagnostic score, but we can talk more about those timeframes and why I think they're appropriate. The other thing that I thought was interesting about the word jive is that it can also mean deceptive talk. Um, and I think most people would describe the LSAT as deceptive. There is verbal difficulty in the test, and so it entails deciphering difficult or deceptive clues. And then finally, the last meaning of jive is sort of a totally separate meaning of the word. It means to dance, or a type of music that compels a certain kind of dance. And that definition I also think is appropriate for our purposes, because although the LSAT is testing some knowledge, it's testing it in an improvisational setting. You don't just regurgitate facts that you know, you execute a skill. And in that sense, LSAT prep is a lot like prepping for an athletic competition or some kind of performative art like dance or music. And so I think all of the meanings of the word jive are really interesting in terms of their connection to what we're doing in terms of LSAT prep. And so that's what I've named my YouTube channel. And if you guys ever want to go back and watch these videos, or if you miss one of our sessions and want to rewatch it, feel free to do so. All right, so I want to talk about this connection for a little bit that I think is relevant. How in the world is the LSAT like learning a foreign language? Or rather, let me start off by saying, if you buy into well, let me start with how. How is it like learning a foreign language? There are terms on the LSAT that, although they are English, the LSAT applies a very specific and technical definition to those terms that we don't use in ordinary life. And in some cases, it combines the terms into phrases that we don't use, even in our casual conversations, necessary and sufficient conditions, for example. We talk about those concepts, of course, but we don't use that language to describe them. So, in a real sense, you are learning to define terms in a new way. That's language acquisition. And what makes LSAT prep even harder is that in some cases, you actually have to unlearn your standing definitions of the terms in order to adopt or incorporate the logical or the LSAT definition of the term. So in some respects, it can be even harder than learning a foreign language, because you have to unlearn some of your conceptions or misconceptions about what these words do and don't mean. Okay, so if you buy my analogy and you think that LSAT prep is similar to learning a foreign language, consider this. I found this blog, a linguist expert talking about how to learn a foreign language, or rather how long it should take to learn a foreign language. And what he says is that according to some research done by the US Foreign Service Institute, it takes 480 hours to get basic fluency in a group 1 language. Those are the easy ones to learn. 720 hours for group 2 to 4 languages, the harder ones. And so the author of the blog, he broke this down into a number of hours. Suppose you were going to study 10 hours a day and take weekends off, a full-time study schedule. How long would it take you to reach that basic fluency in the language? 2 to 3 months of full-time studying. That's just to get basic fluency. But most people don't want just basic fluency in the LSAT. They want professional fluency, or they want mastery of the material. So if you look at the next bullet point, to get from level 2 to level 4 would take perhaps twice as long, the author predicts. 4 to 6 months for the easier languages. 8 to 12 months, sorry, maybe 4 times as long for more difficult language, 8 to 12 months. So if we assume for a moment that the LSAT is an easy language, which I think is maybe not a fair assumption, but let's just assume like best case scenario, and you reach your basic level of fluency in 2 months, and then you take the shortest amount of time, 4 months, to reach your full professional fluency. That's my 6-month plan. It's the best case scenario. So then you'll tell me, yeah, but I know people who did it in 2 months. It's because they didn't have to do step 1. They already had basic level fluency from their college classes, from previous experiences, from other studies. And so they were only executing that second part of the puzzle, going from level 2 to level 4. But if you're starting from scratch, you really should be thinking about this as a long-term process. 6 to 12 months is the proper study regimen for learning the LSAT. So if you're struggling in your first 3 months, you're not alone. Good, that's the way it works. If you're struggling within the first 6 months, it's unfortunate, but it happens. 9 to 12 months, if you're still struggling, you're not alone still. Even beyond a year, it took me 2 years to really master the LSAT. So I'll give you a little bit of perspective on my perspective on the test. I began teaching the LSAT, or rather prior to teaching the LSAT, I was an MCAT instructor. And it was my interest in test prep that led to my learning the LSAT and going to law school and becoming an LSAT tutor. So we can do a little bit of comparisons here between the MCAT and the LSAT. Why does it take so long to prepare for the LSAT? Let's assume for a minute that law school is designed to be a professional degree, a professional graduate degree, similar to a medical degree. It may not be quite as rigorous, but it's a similar kind of program. Then we should expect some similar level of rigor in the admissions exam. And what I know about the MCAT is that it tests about 41 credit hours of material, minimum number of courses that you would have to take just to have the basic knowledge to understand the MCAT. And so I've listed the courses here. Again, I want to emphasize this is a bare minimum. Most pre-med students are going to take far more than 3 hours of biochemistry. And so to really become a master of that material is going to be more than 40 credit hours. But even the bare minimum, we're talking about 1/3 of a bachelor degree over a year's worth of full-time studying. And of course, pre-med students don't take all the hard science classes in 1 year. They spread it out over 4 years because that would be an enormous undertaking to learn all of those hard sciences in 1 year. So let's transition and do the comparison. What would you really need to understand all of the content of the LSAT? There's 4 main categories of passages or information that they test on: natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, and law. And if you wanted to get a broad survey of each of those 4 subject areas, you'd have to take introductory courses in biology and chemistry. You'd have to take introductory courses in several areas of the social sciences like sociology, psychology, art appreciation, and economics. You would have to gain some familiarity in the humanities, history, US government, and then you'd really have to drill down in some of the areas of logic formal logic, informal logic, and the logic of causation. Each of those could easily comprise a semester-long course. And then finally, if you want to really understand the law RC passages, you'll need some context, some background in jurisprudence or legal studies. So, we're looking at a comparable amount of content that you're responsible for if you really want to be diligent and cover all your bases for the material and the vocabulary that you'd have to be fluent in to master the LSAT. So if you're finding it difficult to improve your score and it's taking a long time, don't fret. To some extent, it would be like deciding you wanted to go to medical school and then trying to learn those 41 credit hours worth of material. That would be the task, the precondition to taking the MCAT. And law students seem to think that they can short circuit the process because it's not a knowledge-based exam. It's just an English logic exam. Knowledge in these subject areas contributes to your intuitive logic. So it's sort of true and sort of untrue that it's a pure logic exam. The long-term memories, your content knowledge can aid your short-term working memory, your intuition, your logic. So I think it's unfair to think of the LSAT as purely a logic test. And even if it is, logic itself is a body of knowledge that you need to know. All right, so continuing on, what are we going to do about this? I didn't want to make it all doom and gloom, so it's going to take forever, right? Maybe. Getting your expectations in a reasonable place is step one. Understanding that it's a long-term process and that it's going to involve some consistent work, like a fitness regimen. That's the first step to succeeding on the LSAT, just getting the right mindset. But then what should you be doing about it? Again, I turned to this language analogy and I said, well, what are people saying about how to learn foreign languages? And I found this list, it's a listicle, 10 tips to learn any language from this expert. And what I wanted to think about as I read this list is how many of these tips mirror or coincide the advice that I give my LSAT students. Number one tip on there was know your motivation. I think that's a lot more important in the context of learning a language. Most people firmly understand why they want to learn the LSAT language. They want to go to law school. But maybe people don't truly understand the stakes. Do you understand how much scholarship money is at stake here? Do you understand it's life-changing scholarship money that is at play with your LSAT score? Can that help your motivation? The other thing that I find interesting is that learning projects tend to be best served by intrinsic motivations, not extrinsic motivators. Being curious about the LSAT itself and the subject areas that I discussed on the previous slide, that will be the number one thing toward getting a better score. Being able to embrace the learning process and being satisfied with the intellectual development will go a long way toward pacifying the difficulties that you face on the score front. The second tip on the listicle was find a partner. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that when I prepare to teach or give a lecture, I strive to understand things at a deeper level than I do when I'm just looking to learn. And that's kind of interesting to me. Why am I, as an audience, not as important as my students? Why will I not demand as much level of precision or rigor for my own knowledge as I do when I'm trying to convey that knowledge to others? Being a teacher has really taught me that there's more to learning. It's a more active process, and it involves internalizing the material to such an extent that you can flip it back around and explain it in your own words, paraphrase it, if you will. All right, the next thing, talk to yourself. If you can't find a partner, the author of this listicle suggests that you talk to yourself in the foreign language. This is also good advice for the LSAT. You'll hear people say, well, maybe you should write questions to passages, read articles in The Economist, read articles in Scientific American, and draft LSAT style questions and answer choices to try to wrap your mind around what are the questions asking, what are they getting at, what are the trap answers doing. It's a good way to concretize whether you understand the LSAT or not. Try to speak that language on your own without necessarily having a partner. The other thing is I've invented this wrong answer game. Every time one of my students gets a question wrong, I ask them, take your wrong answer and convert it into a right one. And next week, I'd like to do a whole episode on just that because I think that game is very fun. And I think that it helps you to develop the kind of verbal dexterity that helps you get the next question right, not just understand the current question that you missed. And really, that's the goal, is how to avoid making that mistake on the next question, the next similar question, that is. So the wrong answer game is an innovation of mine, and I'd love to chat about it more next week. The next tip on the listicle was keep it relevant. His advice was, if you understand your motivation, you won't get lost in the textbook. So if you know that you're only interested in conversational Spanish, you're not going to go learn how to, interpret Spanish literature. You don't get lost in the textbooks when you understand your motivation. And I think that's really important for LSAT prep. Your the relevance always has to be for time tests. And it's one of my biggest criticisms of some of the detailed strategy books. All of those strategies are great, but you can't employ them all at once, and they aren't focused on the task at hand, which is, how am I going to improve on my next timed section? That should always be the focus. That should always be the relevance. And anytime you pick up a strategy book, it should be to learn something or correct something that you uncovered on a time test. And then to think about how to attack or approach that more effectively on the next time test, not just to do endless drills or endless exercises. Part of this keep it relevant tip, I think, really overlaps with my strategy planning step. If you're a student of mine, you know that I advocate triple review. And the third step of triple review is strategy planning, which means you take all of the learnings from your time test and from blind review, and you try to sum them up into an action plan. So what? What am I going to do about it now that I know all of that? And that's the ultimate keep it relevant point. What is the relevance of this? What will I do now that I've learned all that? How will I adjust my strategy accordingly to try to get a better score on the next time test? So strategy planning is all about keeping it relevant. The next tip, have fun with it. This one is so not difficult for me. It's hard for me to understand my students who find the LSAT boring. I find it absolutely fascinating. This is like the Library of Alexandria, the LSAT. This is the secrets of modern scholarship. The apex of human knowledge is contained in that exam, and I don't think I'm exaggerating. These are the most compelling ideas in history, science, sociology, climate science. Name your subject area of modern scholarship, and it has a component on the LSAT that is well written and well taught. And so the content that you can learn from the LSAT is just as meaningful as the skills that you can learn by prepping for the LSAT and by mastering the LSAT. It says to have fun with it. The author of the book was saying, be creative. And I kind of harken back. I was a jazz musician for many years. And when I was struggling to improve, I remember some of the master musicians telling me, look, it's like a language and you have to think about it more like a language. And as a 20-year-old, that made no sense to me. I wanted to read a book, and then I wanted to regurgitate the contents of that. And then I wanted a pat on the back for doing it. And jazz doesn't work that way at all. It's very spontaneous, and it's very much predicated on feel and communication. And so it took me a long time to really appreciate that. And preparing this lecture made me think, I sure hope I'm not coming across like those jazz masters where I'm like, communicate more, man. And I'm the young kid, like, what the hell are you talking about? But I really do hope that you guys will think about the LSAT more in terms of language acquisition and communication and interpretation, and less in terms of categorization and algorithms. You're not going to learn how to read from a book. The PowerScore Bibles aren't going to tell you a step-by-step process to read and interpret English persuasive essays. And that's essentially what you have to do to excel on the LSAT. Okay, let's move on with the listicle, and I will open it up to questions in a minute. The next one, act like a child. I love this one. Children are endlessly curious and have no sense of shame with their mistakes. And it's part of the reason why they are brilliant learners and adults aren't. We find a lot of shame in our mistakes to the extent that we will avoid making mistakes to avoid the shame associated with them. So if you want to be a good LSAT learner, you have to try to strip away this self-consciousness and have a desire to play in the language and a willingness to make mistakes. And I'll share something else with you guys. I've grown up around Spanish my whole life. I grew up in El Paso, spent a tremendous amount of time in Mexico, more than my parents would have approved of as a teenager. But my Spanish is absolutely horrible, horrible. And the reason for it is this unwillingness to make mistakes. Because I'm so proficient in English, it feels ridiculous to me to speak this very basic language that I can't communicate well in. And so I avoid the process entirely. But if you want to excel on the LSAT, you should embrace mistakes. I love missing LSAT questions. If I didn't continue to miss LSAT questions, I would go do something else. This is why I got out of bar prep. I kept moving up in my test prep, sort of experience. And I felt like, okay, I've done everything I can in the LSAT world. I need to go and do bar prep now that I have a law degree and actually use my legal knowledge. And so I've spent 5 or 6 years now doing bar prep, including creating an online bar prep product for UWorld. But ultimately, I wanted to go back to the LSAT. And part of the reason is that I reached a point where I don't miss bar exam questions ever. They can't trick me anymore, because if the question were capable of tricking me, my knowledge of the law is so sharp at this point that if the question were capable of tricking me, it would honestly be a gray area of the law that would be unfair to test. So that test is boring for me, but the LSAT continues to challenge me. 20 years after I started this journey, I still miss LSAT questions occasionally. And I love it when I do, because I can look back at those questions and say, what in the world was the author thinking? How could he or she have believed that was a logical sequence of words to string together? And what's the underlying structure of that? How is it similar to the other questions I've done in the past? And if I've missed it, then the really interesting question becomes, how is that different? Why didn't I catch it? What are they doing here that is different from what I've seen before? And so all of that is why I'm good at the LSAT, because I don't mind making mistakes. I'll do it right in front of my students and tell them the following week, whoops, blew that. Because if I'm not making mistakes, I'm not learning, and I want to model for my students the right way to learn. You have to be constantly challenging yourself, which means looking at the material in the most challenging ways. All right, leave your comfort zone is the other tip from our language expert. My entire triple review strategy is predicated on leaving your comfort zone. Time sections suck. I hate prepping for class because I have to sit down that morning and do a time section. And if I don't get a perfect score on the time section, then I'm not validated as an LSAT teacher. So it's all risk and no reward. If I get a perfect score, you're the tutor, that's expected. If I don't, then it's like, well, what's wrong with you? How can you be the tutor if you can't do it perfectly? So I find time sections to be extraordinarily stressful, as I'm sure you do. That's, stepping out of your comfort zone is doing this process in a really quick pace. Blind review is also about stepping out of your comfort zone, because in my blind review step, I require my students, or I ask them to create rationales that are far, far deeper than anything they have time for on a time test. They have to think about these questions on a deeper level, structure them, organize them, determine what the premises mean. What are the hidden assumptions here? Even if they're not asking that question, I ask them to go through the whole process, interpret everything very diligently on blind review. And so that's also about leaving your comfort zone. And then strategy planning is about formulating a plan about how you're going to read differently. You've been reading for 20 plus years. Changing your reading habits is also about leaving your comfort zone. And so the way that I like to describe this is you have to become comfortable with discomfort if you want to be good at the LSAT. And it's why I think that my jazz experience played so well into my transition as a test prep expert, because when you're improvising as a jazz musician, you don't have a lot of time to make decisions. You know, the beat one is coming. What note are you going to play? Get ready, go. And you have to make a decision and execute it. And you don't always make the right decision. Sometimes you lay a bomb and it's a horrible note, but you go on. The song doesn't stop. You don't get a do-over. And that really taught me a lot about improvising on tests. You don't get a do-over on these questions. You have to keep moving. You have to be nimble. You have to skip the stuff that's hard, and you have to take the test on your own terms and not insist on taking it according to Robin Singh's approach. He's the founder of PowerScore, or I could name all the top, test takers. They're all very brilliant people who founded these top companies. All right, the next tip, just one more slide after this one, then I'll open it up to questions. Listen. The advice was, if you want to be a good language speaker, you have to listen to people speaking that language and try to imitate them. And so you need a tutor, as much as I hate to say it. Either a tutor, or you need a really robust set of explanations that you trust. And I think explanations can be a crutch. So that's advice that I give with some trepidation. So we can talk about that more in a future session, how to use explanations, but you need to have someone very fluent in the LSAT language to be able to correct your errors and to be able to model for you the correct way to think about the questions and to articulate the logic in your predictions for the answers. I mean, the better someone is at that, the more skilled they are as a tutor, and then unfortunately the more they cost to work with. And so it's a very difficult requirement to manage. How are you going to get access to someone with this who knows this very contrived language? And I find that even a lot of the tutors are not particularly skilled in the LSAT language. They're skilled at getting answers right, but when they're forced to defend it in a verbal debate, I find a lot of the intelligence kind of falls away, and there's not a lot of substance behind it. So finding high quality speakers to listen to is very difficult. And what I want you guys to do is think about, what do you need me to tell you? If you were going to get in a tutoring session with me, what would be the questions that you ask me? And for those of you who are my students and who we do tutoring sessions with, what are the things that we don't get to in class? I want you to attend these weekly sessions and talk to me about that, especially if it's strategy planning. If we get hyper-focused on questions and we're missing the forest for the trees, let's take a moment to back out at the end of each week and say, okay, now what's our strategy plan? How are we going to navigate the next section going forward? Okay, last slide. Watch others talk. This one I thought at first had no corollary. The author of the listicle was talking about physically watching someone's mouth movements as you try to learn the language to see how to replicate those sounds. And I thought, well, the LSAT's a mental exam. You can't watch my mind work. But I think you'd be surprised at what has been lost by moving to online learning. When I used to do logic games on the board in front of a class of students, I would draw my diagram and I would show them my finger work. I would show them, all right, suppose we take the RS block and we put it like this. And then the ST block has to fit like this. And I'm overlapping my fingers to show them which boxes are used. And it creates this visual image without having to draw anything at all, just by using my fingers. And so I'll be glad when the pandemic is over and I can start doing some live events again. Maybe I need to get a board so that I can replicate that online. That's another thing that I'll consider doing. I can draw and share my screen, but the students don't see what I'm doing with my fingers to help my mind make sense of that drawing. So I do think watching people work can be helpful, particularly on logic games. All right, his last tip was dive in. This has to do with immersion. I'm sure you've heard this if you've thought about learning a foreign language. You don't learn it best from a book. You learn it best from immersion. You go live in that country for 6 months and don't speak your foreign language for a little while. It's also why I have adopted triple review. Triple review forces you to start grappling with the actual exam to get your head out of the strategy guides. It also forces you to start grappling with time sections early in the process. And so it's a way to dive right in. Whatever process you use, though, you should do it enthusiastically. That was the point of the article. He was advocating his particular product for language acquisition. And so dive in meant buy my thing. And I'll orient my session the same way that I suggest you guys use triple review. We teach it in our private tutoring, we teach it in our classes, and we have some products coming out that will help guide you through the triple review process. And if you guys are interested in beta testing our products, reach out to me. Ashton and Mickey have done some work on that front, and they've helped me get some typos out of my forms, and they've helped me think about whether I'm on the right track in terms of how these are organized. So I'd love for you guys to take a look at those if you're interested in seeing the beta versions and helping me design some of that. But the bottom line is that triple review is predicated on learning science. It's predicated on this concept of spaced repetition. And I harp on it so much because when I work with MCAT students, I know that they can't memorize 46 hormones by looking at the table once. They're going to have to take that table home, make flashcards, and do it 100 times. The LSAT's a little different because you don't have specific facts that they're going to call upon when they craft the questions. It's more of a skill-based test. But in order to learn those skills, you need repetition, just like you would if it were an athletic thing. Think about swinging a golf club effectively or pitching a ball effectively. There's a number of steps and mechanics to it. And if any of those steps or mechanics break down, you can end up with an errant pitch or an errant shot in golf. And the same thing for the LSAT. There's a number of steps. You have to execute them over and over and practice them before they become proficient. And an error in any one of the steps can kind of send you astray. And if you're interested in either of those articles, I've shared the links here. I will post this to YouTube and you guys can follow up with that. But thank you for being patient with the presentation. I will open it up to questions. I've got another 25 minutes to chat. So does anyone want to take this opportunity to ask me anything? I'm doing free tutoring for certain questions.
Hey Keith, it's
Yeah.
Faiza.
Hey,
How are
Faiza.
you?
Good.
I have been doing well, and now my score is like regressing from like 160s to mid 150s, and I'm in the practice test 80s.
Yeah.
And we had done 86 together,
Uh-huh.
but that was in the 160s. So I'm kind of just struggling with the confidence of like being in the 80s, but also just seeing like my reading comprehension going down the more I feel. It's like I can't put all my eggs in one basket. I have to like study everything all the time, but it's hard when I'm trying to get better at certain things. Like I know I'm bad at necessary assumption. I know I'm bad at in and out games. So when I focus on those two, it's like something else gives. So
Sure.
being consistent across the board, I'm noticing in the past couple tests is not working for me, and how to get better at that.
Okay, yeah, let's address a couple things here because there's a bunch of stuff going on. Number one, the prep tests in the 80s are hard. Why the difficulty is increasing? Is it, I don't know, it's subjective, but to me, they're getting harder, especially LR and logic games too. Reading comp to me has always been very difficult. So just staying the same is bad enough for reading comp. But what can account for that? How can a test be getting harder when it's supposed to be standardized and sort of normalized, comparable from test to test? And I think that in some respects it's an illusion. It's because the test prep industry has time to digest the material. You know, once a prep test is published, people like me and JY from Seven Sage and you know all the other big tutors I could name, we all start digesting it. We all start unpacking it and coming up with strategies for our students to use to beat that particular dynamic of the test. So in order for the test to stay relevant, they have to, you know, constantly shuck and jive. They have to be responsive to that. They can't just keep hammering those same concepts that we have perfected. From the test taker's point of view, it seems like, well, that sucks. It's getting harder. But the truth is, it was always this hard because when the prep tests in the 70s were new, we hadn't had a chance to unpack those yet. You know, 10 years ago, the prep tests in the 60s were really challenging. And it was the ones in the 50s that everyone was saying, those are so easy. How come they're getting harder? So it's evolving. It's not necessarily getting harder. And to address a couple more of your points, when you get to the prep tests in the 80s, that's where I start telling my students, stop measuring your score. The prep tests in the 80s are just different. At this point, you've learned all the fundamentals. Now it's about refining for the modern philosophy of the test writers. And so my philosophy is that they will not beat me or trick me with something that they've shown me before. You know, you said like it's a moving target. It's this is the gap, and then that's the gap, and then something else gives. It is a moving target. Every time they show me something new in the prep tests in the 80s, I used a repetitious process to perfect it. My attitude is, if they do that again, I got them. Please do that again. Please do that again. Even the hard stuff, I work it out to such a level of detail that it becomes easy to me. And by doing that, what I allow myself to do is to work through the predictable material very quickly and efficiently. And I bank a whole bunch of extra time. And I wish I could tell you guys that on those hardest questions, boy, I just bang those out too, and they're easy for me, but that's not true. The hardest questions are very difficult for me, and I sometimes get them wrong. And the only way that I'm able to tackle them and have a chance at getting them right is with extra time. The hardest questions I could never answer in a minute and 3/4 or whatever the average time is per question. I just couldn't do it. An easy logic game I do in 5 minutes, bank time for the hard one. An easy reading comp passage, I'm done in 6 or 7 minutes. I'm banking time for the harder ones. An easy LR question, 30 seconds to a minute on some of them, because I've seen the pattern so many times and I've done blind review to such a deep level that it's like, yeah, whatever. I've seen every variation of that. I've diagrammed them all different ways. I've talked about it with a dozen students. That you're not tricking me with that, not today. But then when I get to that hard stuff, that bizarre game, that, you know, when they started introducing new style of answer choices on LR, when they started testing causal reasoning in a different way, those things tripped me up the first time I saw them. And, you know, I get down to a 50-50 and I'm sort of on the hardest questions. I'm just, you know, it's a matter of luck. The last point that I want to make to what you said is that I wish students would appreciate how much the luck factor plays into your score. If you just think about which section are you best at, not everyone is equally good at every section. You know, people have a different strength, a different preference. Well, what if your strength, you know, happens to be the hard section versus the easy one, and your weakness happens to be the hard section versus the easy one? That affects your score as an individual, but it doesn't affect the statistics for 30,000 test takers, because what's hard for you is easy for someone else. You know, it all evens out and the statisticians are happy, but you end up with a score that is below your average or below your potential. That's like saying, you know, like, hey, the Jazz should have won the the NBA finals in 96 or whatever. I'm like, yeah, shoulda, woulda, coulda. But they didn't. Whatever happened, whatever went wrong that day, they didn't win. And the same thing happens with test prep. You could be sick that day. You could be faced with an exam that does not align with your strengths. You could, whatever, a million stories about whatever particular thing causes you to underperform that day. So I think that counting on multiple attempts should also be part of your approach. As soon as someone comes to me and they say, I just want to take it once, I'm already cringing. Like, of course, we would all love to take it once. I'd like to win the lottery too. But realistically, is that giving yourself the best shot at at a good score? When you're dealing with the luck factor, that's like saying, I'm just going to sit down and play one hand of poker. And, if I'm good enough, I'm going to win, right? Like, no, there's some luck involved. You're going to have to play 100 hands of poker if you want the luck factor to even out and for your skill to shine through. You don't need 100 LSAT attempts for your skill to shine through, but you need 2 or 3. You need to get a couple different versions of that form. You need one that aligns with your skills, and you need to be healthy and attentive on that particular day. All the stars align, and then you get your perfect score. But it doesn't always happen on the first attempt. So those are the things that I would, you were talking about your scores going up and down. To some extent, it could be just the luck factor. Not every section is equally difficult, and you're being presented with tests that don't align with your strengths. So there's your opportunity. You take those low scores. You've missed a lot of questions to earn that low score. Not that it's low, but the disappointing score. That gives you a disproportionate amount of things to study. That means that these tests in the 80s are the ones that should be the most fun and the most challenging and the most formative in your intellectual development, because they're really hard. Yeah, okay, so one other thing, you want something more practical. They're testing causal reasoning in a new way. And is it a new way? It's got a new wrinkle to it. Causal reasoning is very complex. That's why I put as one of the courses that I would recommend if I were designing a curriculum for an LSAT student, it would be the philosophy of causation, logic of causation. I think that it is so complex that in and of itself would take a semester to really unpack. I've spent the last couple of weeks reading these philosophy articles about causation. And at some points I get frustrated. I'm like, just tell me the model, tell me the truth. Instead of going through all of these sophistications and nuances. And, after I read it again and think about it a little more deeply, I start to come around and say, there is no simplification. There is no way around those nuances. The whole idea of causation, it might truly be the most complex concept humans have ever come up with. What caused the world to exist? Like, it's truly like the fundamental question, right? And we're talking about it as if it's simple on the LSAT. The materials that are out there are treating causation as if it's simple, and it's not simple. And so Jacob Feldman and I are trying to develop, I think we have developed a strong model for causal reasoning that isn't too complex. I mean, here's the difficulty. How much can we saddle our students with? How many layers of a model can they stand? We're already asking them to learn many models, learn the negation test, learn the question types, learn the game types, learn how to diagram, learn conditional reasoning, learn this, learn that. Can our students stand to learn another thing? Well, but here's the thing. Causation is on the test. We didn't choose that. Like, we're not saying, hey, learn causation for fun. Like, no, it's on the LR section. There are a ton of causal questions. So then the question becomes, okay, well, how do you study causation? At what level of technicality? You don't go all the way to the level of the philosophers, which is where I'm going, but I think you need something deeper than what the existing materials are giving you. And so we're crafting that. And that's something that's difficult for me to share. We kind of consider it proprietary and we teach it in our classes. But let me think about that, Faiza. If I can get a private session with you, I'll review the tape and see if your question wins the prize. But if I can get alone with you and not broadcast it to the general public, I might be able to share some details about how we unpack some of the hardest causal questions.
Thank you.
Sure. I'll
Yeah,
talk to Jake. Maybe he would let me do a free session, but I think in general, this is where we feel like we have the strongest leverage over the other materials. And we'd really like to write a book about causal reasoning and not just the LSAT. We find it very fascinating in the law too. We taught a torts class a couple weeks back. One of the cases that we read, Palsgraf case, is about it's about the duty element of negligence, according to Cardozo, the majority opinion. But the dissenting justice, Justice Andrews, he believed that the issue of the case really should be framed in terms of proximate causation. He thought it was a causation issue. And so even though it's not supposed to be a causation case, causation ended up sneaking into the dialogue. Causation's everywhere when it comes to criminal law and torts. And so having a strong foundation in like what we mean when we talk about causation, that will go a long way toward your understanding of a big chunk of your torts class in law school. I think it's maybe a little less focused on in criminal law. In criminal law, I think you tend to know. It tends to be more concrete when someone caused the result. Maybe they just don't charge frequently when they haven't, whereas there's more sort of frivolous litigation in torts. It becomes a more of a hair splitting issue. What was the cause? But at any rate, I find it to be one of the defining things about understanding torts is knowing the role of causation. And I find it to be really interesting the way we educate people in America, because when I went to law school, I didn't have a strong philosophical framework for what causation meant. And I bought into the legal rules for causation. And it's not until now that I'm developing this framework for causation for the LSAT that I'm starting to go back and read about some of the legal causation cases and think about them on a deeper level. Sort of like thinking about missed opportunities. Had I understood causation better, I would have had a deeper experience in law school. But c'est la vie. I'll recreate it now. That's always been my attitude. Embrace your weaknesses and try to fix them. It's never too late. All right, do we have time? Yeah, we have time for another question. Would anyone else like to jump in? Welcome, Nilo. You've been quiet. I don't think I've seen you come to any of my sessions before. Would you like to introduce yourself? And
Yeah, for sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Nilo. Yes, this is my first time. I haven't met you yet either, Keith, so I hope you're doing well. And I just wanted to kind of see what one of your sessions kind of looks like and kind of get a gist of that. I guess in terms of the LSAT, I started studying about 3 months ago, I'd say. I'm currently in the high 160s.
Nice.
Thank you. And I am also studying like my past tests are all in the 80s as well. So me and Faiza actually go over our exams together. So we're like kind of study buddies.
All right.
So when we do our exam, we're going to be going over, I don't know, 84 or 83 today, later in the day. And so that's kind of how we study. So I really liked this session. Just want to like give some feedback, I guess, and like kind of getting some of those tips. I know a lot of, like, I don't have a tutor at this point. Like I haven't been in a tutoring session or anything. So it's been mostly self-study. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to see more of like the philosophical kind of side of things, because that's not in any, like, you don't see that in books, right? Because like books are more like the strategy.
Mm-hmm. And
then here's like step-by-step like what you do. So I think, yeah, I agree with your point about in order to get that kind of aspect, you need a person to do it. It's not going to be done like in a book format or something that's kind of provided like that. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of just the intro of me. Oh, I'm also in Canada, so I don't know where everybody else is located, but I'm up there.
Yeah, well, thank you for introducing yourself. One of the paradoxes as a tutor is that when you're starting out, if you're a good communicator and a good teacher, you can offer your students things that the companies and the courses can't. A real personalized approach. You can offer them a kind of motivational factor that you can't always get from a book or from a teacher who's working with a lot of other, whose attention is divided with a whole class. So this paradox that I'm talking about is that if you're good at tutoring, you become exclusive. You become less able to tutor people because your rate goes up and up. And so Jake and I have kind of experienced this paradox where we've had a lot of success in our tutoring professions, and our rates have now reached a point where the people who can afford my rate now could afford twice that or 3 times that. And the people who can't afford my rate right now are so far from being able to afford it that even cutting it in half doesn't really attract them. So I'm at this really strange price point where I could go much higher and still get it. And I could go much lower and not do significantly more business. There's a lot of, what is that called? Price elasticity or something like that. But it's a real awkward place that I'm in my career. And the way that some people approach it is just jack the rate up. If people want to pay it, allow them to pay it. And that was an easy way for me to approach it for a long time, particularly when I was doing bar prep and LSAT prep was just a side gig. But Jake and I want to bring our services to more people now. And so I've been talking about this yesterday and again today. What we want to do is have kind of a tutoring collective where there's a small subscription fee. And if we can pass that fee on to the students, what that will enable Jake and I to do is do sessions like this with subscribers where we can share copyrighted material. And right now, we're limited to doing that with small classes. And even then, the amount of sharing that we can do is limited to what we can get away with under fair use law. So LSAC has this new thing they're doing, a new way of licensing, a new way for tutors to license the content. I think it's brilliant. It's super inexpensive. What they want is $30 per student. The student has to have Law Hub. The tutor pays a $30 fee, and then you can share as much licensed content with that student, like all of it. So if we could get the monthly fee, we could schedule sessions where we're doing this section on this day, that section on that day. And that's kind of what we're working toward over the next month of putting that kind of thing together. Okay, Faiza had to go, but I wanted to talk about that for your benefit, Nilo, because you said you haven't had a tutor and you're doing very well with your self-prep. I imagine, at least for me, the real roadblock came about where you are. When I hit the low 170s, I didn't have the knowledge to understand how to get better. I mean, I was so good at the LSAT. Who was I going to ask at that point? The people who had scored better than I didn't always know how they had done it, or their methods were just so different from mine that I found that their methods actually, detracted from my performance and weren't helping me close that final gap. And so I think one thing that could really benefit you at this point is a group of really high level thinkers like me and Jake. And so if we can put that together, stay in touch with me, and we'll see if it's something that interests you. And that goes for all of you. Some of you I work with private tutoring, some with the pro bono sessions. But once we get that collective going, I think that will be an opportunity to do some really rigorous work for a low cost for our students.
What I really like about Keith and Jake teaming up, I took a couple of his triple review classes, are they'll on occasion debate the theory of some of the like the logical reasoning questions or the games and all that. And so whenever I listen to them, I'm getting two different viewpoints on how to approach different LSAT problems. They're in line with each other on a lot of it, but every once in a while they'll debate on an approach to see it, and it gives me the opportunity to think about a problem from different angles, which helps me to better understand the problems, if that makes sense. So it's not just one viewpoint that I'm getting, but it's more than one, and they're both highly intelligent viewpoints. And so that's one reason why I love their classes, and I've learned so much from Keith, because I've worked mostly with Keith, but their classes together are fun.
Well, thanks for the plug, Ashton. You've been really great to work with. And I'll say this, Jacob and I, we approach the test, when it comes to our strategies, we have very, very different takes, almost opposite approaches. But when it comes to our teaching philosophy, we're perfectly aligned. We both believe in experiential learning, flipped classroom, let the student try it first, let them fail before you intervene. So it's really interesting because we believe in the same way of teaching, but then when it comes down to the explanation itself, the nuts and bolts of the question, we probably disagree more often than we agree. Like when we're prepping for class, it has to be a matter of like, you do these, I'll do those, because otherwise we'll just debate endlessly about what to do with the questions. And so it ends up being highly informative because Ashton's right, you get two different approaches. They're both correct. It's hard for me to ever say that Jake is wrong. It's just a matter of emphasis. I tend to think about different things than he tends to think about. Or I take a different path to get to the same place that he ends up getting to. But getting both of those perspectives is important for two reasons. Because if you're struggling, you can choose the one that's more intuitive, that resonates with you better. But the other thing is, if it's a strength of yours, you can take the other approach, the more difficult one, and master it. And then you truly are the master. And so the example that I'll give you before I finish today's session is that I tend to do logic games from a very inferential perspective. I try to make as many inferences up front as possible. And when it works, the answers to the questions are simple. The only difficulty I had is that occasionally I would miss a deduction, and there would be a question or two that just became absolute time traps because I couldn't see the distinction that would allow me to choose one answer over another answer. So in comes Jake. We start working together, and Jake treats logic games like a computer. It's an exercise in brute force. He doesn't make any deductions. He just sets up the game and he starts going with question one. He tries answer choice A, he tries answer choice B, he tries answer choice C. I mean, like, I'm still thinking about what does this mean? I'm like up in the philosophical clouds and he's on question two already. And so it was really interesting to me because learning his approach, I don't do it his way. I still am sort of inference first. But when I hit that time trap, I have a way out. I brute force it and then move on to the next question. It doesn't represent that kind of problem for me that it used to represent. And similarly for Jake, although he could answer all the questions using this highly mechanical strategy, it would take forever. I mean, like, he'd be finishing as the last seconds tick off the clock. He was really at risk of not finishing the section on every section. I mean, it takes a ton of work to do that for every single answer choice. And by learning the processes of inferences that I bring to the table, he's now able to answer a few of the questions because he sees the inference before he does the brute force work. He's still not an inference first test taker, but he doesn't have time trouble anymore because he sees enough of the inferences so that brute force is a viable strategy. And for me, inference first is still a viable strategy because if I miss an inference or I get into trouble, I have that secondary strategy to as a backup. I can brute force my way out of it. And we have similar techniques for logic or for LR, where I come at the question one way, he comes at it a different way. And whichever way is better for you is the way you should approach it. But if that way fails, or if the question is extraordinarily difficult, knowing the alternative approach gives you another tool in the kit to, to employ. So I would strongly recommend that you guys attend Jake's free office hours. He posts a lot in the LSAT group. And as soon as we get our act together and start offering some paid classes in the near future, please take them. And if we can really get organized and get our collective together with the subscription kind of model, I think that's where the biggest, the best interactions are going to come between me and my students. So reach out to me if you guys want to chat about anything. I do free consultations. If I haven't worked with you before and you want to sit down for an hour and think about, where you should go, send me a message. If you want to attend this every week, I'm going to do the LSAT Vets recording every Wednesday. And then what I intend to do is take the best bits of it, chop them up, and publish them on TikTok. And so if I choose a portion that you were involved with, I'll reach out to you and schedule a free tutoring session for that. Thanks for coming, everybody. I have tomorrow a session for non-traditional students. So if you are a working professional or have children or older than most law school applicants and you'd like to come tomorrow, please feel free. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you so much, Keith.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.